So I sat at this table over here, and there's some really great discussion about ambassadors. And I'm just going to share one of the points that they were talking about. When we talk about our testimony, it's almost like we all have Instagram and Facebook, right? And it came out at this table, a really good point, that we have these influencers or brand ambassadors, and their job is to go out and constantly talk about the brand, right? So they're promoting and constantly selling, and they have to be on Instagram all the time. They have to do frequent posts. You can't do a post once every 5 weeks and expect, your brand to go up. So that's what our stories are like. We have to continue to tell our stories wherever we are, however big or however small, all the time. We're living, walking ambassadors with a testimony to tell. And there's no one way to tell it. There's as many women, there's that many ways to tell a testimonial. But we've invited Matt Shively to come. And Matt Shively, if you don't know him, he's on staff here at the Grove, but he was crucial in getting the counseling ministry started, which is a counseling ministry here at the Grove, but it's open to everyone. And the goal there is to be a place where we're looking at people's complete needs, right? Spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. And so he's built something here with the help of the church and the community where people can come and talk and have conversations about some really difficult topics. So Matt, I couldn't think of a better person to ask and just come and talk with us and share with us about our stories and our testimonials. So if you all could welcome Matt Shively here. Thank you so much, Matt, for being here.
Thank you, Crystal. Well, you might think, for me, this would be intimidating, talking to a room full of women, but I live with only women, and so it's very comfortable for me. I have 3 daughters, my wife, even all the pets are female, so this is my lot in life, and I like it, actually. It's good. So it's an honor to be here talking with you, you awesome ladies of the Grove, and what Crystal just said is so true, and all day long, I hear stories. I hear people's stories. I sometimes hear their sad stories, right? Well, most of the time I hear their sad stories. But the thing is, even in a sad story, there's always a thread of hope. And that hope comes from the Christ in you. And so on top of just hearing stories and dialoguing over people's stories in the counseling setting, one of the cool things I get to do with our Celebrate Recovery ministry that meets on Monday nights is I get to kind of coach up and help people see that their lives, their comeback story, because in CR it's usually a comeback story, has a lot of weight and a lot of power because it's God's story being flowing from and through them. So Celebrate Recovery is a ministry that the way we kind of meet, we meet every Monday night. Half of our year is the Celebrate Recovery basically handbook. There's lessons from the 12 steps and the 8 principles. But the other half of the year, so every other week, is somebody's testimony. Somebody gets up and they read their testimony, they read their story. And so I'm going to give you some practical ways to start thinking through your story today here in a minute. But I want to first back up and tell you a little bit of my process with the idea of telling my story. I grew up in a church, and I remember being in youth group, and I had a youth pastor telling all of us, hey, you guys need to start working through your testimony. And I remember thinking, but my testimony is boring. I got nothing exciting that's ever happened in my life at all. No one's going to read that story. That's the kind of story the old school newspaper, they bury on the back page, right? Because they had to put it on there. That's my story. So I started from the first time I heard what a testimony was, downplaying my own testimony. And it's been a struggle my entire life of me believing that I have a story worth hearing. Maybe some of you can relate to that. Maybe you feel like, yeah, who wants to hear my story? My story's, yeah, it's blah. Or my story is so bad or so much as how am I redeemable, right? It could swing one of 2 ways. So in high school, which made it worse, there was this guy in my small group. I was a sophomore. He was a senior named Mikey. And Mikey had the story, okay? The story that we all kind of sort of wish we had as our story. Maybe not the bad stuff, but so Mikey gets up, he's 17 years old, and he has been, redeemed from selling drugs on the street, and he had his bookies after him, and he was up on the tallest building in Omaha, Nebraska, which is not very tall, and he was about to jump off, right? And then Jesus got a hold of his life, and now he's on fire for the Lord, and he wanted to be a missionary in South America. And I'm like, mic drop, bro. Like what in the world? We can't do any, like you just set the bar so high. What can we do? I can't compete with that. How can I compare? Did you hear it right there? That's what we do. We try to compare our stories. We try to compare our stories to other people's stories. Mikey's story is powerful, but it was powerful because it was Mikey's story, and God redeemed him, and God was working with him. And just a little end of the story, he actually did move to Peru, marry a Peruvian woman, and he lives in Peru. And Mikey lived out his goal of being a missionary, and it's pretty cool to see how his story is still being written, just like all of ours are. But that is what I kind of want to address from the get-go. You do have a story to tell, and we need to not compare our stories to other people's stories. That comparison thing is, as Crystal just mentioned, social media. That is the struggle of social media, in my opinion, is it creates this place where we compare, right? Am I enough? Am I good enough? Do I measure up? Do I have as much as this person, right? And it can create that culture. It's also great for connecting with people that live far from you, and that's all great. But that comparison thing is something we got to watch, because there's a level where we need to remember that God isn't holding us up to everybody else. He loves us for who we are, because we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And the story he's writing in our lives is awesome, compelling, beautiful, because it's not just your story, it's God's story. So what we do when we say, I don't have a story, no one wants to hear this, this is not good enough for anyone to hear, let alone, me, it was boring to go through or whatever, right? We're muting ourselves. We go through this process of self-muting. And I mute myself a lot. Sometimes I feel like even in a conversation, I find myself muting, pulling back. Ooh, I'm annoying them now. I don't know if they want to hear that, right? And there's a level where, some self-awareness can go a long way. But we do that as a default of, I'm going to just press the mute button on myself because, man, I am too much, or because I'm not enough. We swing between those two extremes all the time. I'm too much, or I'm not enough. So let me challenge you with this. When you actually mute yourself and your story, you could be muting God, because your story is God's story. God is writing a story in your life, and by you sharing your story, it's pointing back to the author of that story. And so, because of that, share away. It has power because it's God's story. God working through you, and only you. Like if I know some of you in this room, right? If I was to get up and tell your story, like it might be great, it might be awesome, but there's power in you telling your story because it's your story. It's in process. God is writing it. You've been through it, all the emotions that go into your story, right? All the ups and the downs and the middles. There's a lot of middles in life. We don't call those out enough, in my opinion. So again, I just want to kind of remind you, even if you felt that you don't have a good story, or you felt that you've messed up too much for your story to be valid, both extremes are not true. God has something in your story, your specific story, maybe you think it's mundane, but he doesn't think it's mundane because he sees you and he hears you and he knows what he's writing and he knows what's coming next, which makes it even more exciting. So, why should we go through the process of writing your testimony? And I'm going to start with, I think you should first start with writing your testimony. So again, Crystal said there's a million different ways to do a testimony. I'm just going to give you one little outline of a way to start the process. It's not the only way, and it might not even be the way you choose to do it, and that is totally fine, but I want to give you something practical. I love practicality in messages, something I can hold on to, right? And so that's what we're going to do. So the first is like, why should I write it down? And in CR, when we're coaching people through, we tell them not only do you have to write your testimony when you're going to give it, you have to read it when it comes to giving it. And the reason for that is one reason is it keeps you on task. It helps you kind of stay on target. A lot of times when I get up, I have notes, but then I just start going, right? I tell stories that weren't on my page. I lose track of where I'm going. But with your testimony, right, we want to help you kind of craft it. And so with CR, those old insecurities crept up again. First year of CR, I realized we're brand new. We don't have anyone ready to do their testimony. I'm the leader. I should probably figure that out. And then the first thing I thought, no one wants to hear my story. And all those old insecurities started coming up. And then I sat down after procrastinating it for weeks. And I just wrote. And I wrote and I wrote. And I wrote like 9 pages. And it was actually incredibly therapeutic. Because as I write, I process. And as I process, I start to put stuff away. Thoughts, maybe traumas, pains that have been just kind of stuck up inside me, right? I'm able to actually, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was holding on to that. And so for the longest time, every time I would tell my story without writing it, new things would come up that I'd forgotten about. And that's great. But when I practiced the discipline of writing it down, it helped me kind of streamline it and kind of see all the pieces that God had orchestrated in my story to this point. And so here, let's use some scripture to just remind us that, God is for our testimonies too. The first kind of point I have here is God is with you. Because you might, when I said, hey, testimony, and you thought, my testimony, maybe the first thought was fear. And so to that, I want to remind you that God is with you and he's writing the story with you. And so there's nothing to be afraid of. It's his story anyway. Hopefully that can take some pressure off, right? To think it's God's story, that you're just the mouthpiece. So Isaiah 43, another prophet, right, says this, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." So God goes with you. He was with you when your story was unfolding. So he'll be with you when you tell that story, right? It just makes sense. The second thought on this, the reason to tell your testimony, your story has validity inherently because of God. It's valid and it's impactful. And our testimony nights, as we go through every other week or so in CR, we always get to our open share tables after, and the first thing that my table always says is, wow, that was powerful. And the second thing is, wow, I can relate to a lot of the parts of that story. So that tells me why, right there, testimonies are so vital. There's power in them because they're God writing them through you, and their relatability. And there's, again, back to that whole continuum of us feeling not enough and then feeling like we're too much. Relatability and knowing we're not alone and that other people have gone through similar things, or maybe other people have gone through things I haven't gone through, but I see God working in their life, and that brings me hope and encouragement. 1 John 5:10 says it this way, "Whoever believes in the Son of God accepts this testimony. Whoever does not believe God has made him out to be a liar because they have not believed the testimony God has given about his Son." So testimony is this avenue of God's truth being told in different avenues in different ways. And then 1 Thessalonians, this is the message. It says, "Your lives are echoing the Master's word." I love that. Your lives are echoing the Master's word. The news of your faith in God is out. We don't even have to say anything anymore. You are the message. So your story, your life is the message of hope, is the message of God sending his Son to redeem us, to restore us to life eternal one day and life to the full now. Right? That's your story. All right, so we're going to kind of give you a little outline here for you to have an idea of where to start. Because for me, it's always, this is great, but where do I start? Like, how do I get going? So the way CR kind of breaks down our testimonies is we kind of break it into 4 sections. And I'm kind of adapting this from some of the CR material. So the first section is the old me. The old me. What was your life like before Jesus? And this right here, high school Matt would have said, this is why I can't write my testimony. I was baptized when I was 6. I don't remember a time before Jesus. I don't even know, right? But that doesn't mean that from 6 on, I haven't had my ups and downs and my moments where I wasn't leaning into Jesus the way I should. So what were some of the things that have maybe happened in your life? What's the insanity in your life? That's might be a trigger word for some of you, and I get it, but it's true. Life before Jesus, there's parts of it that are just, they're off. They're not where we could be or should be, right? So what are some of those moments in your life? There's 5 little questions with this first section. It's got the most, by the way, as we go through this. But the second question, try to give you guys time to write this down. What are some of the circumstances that others can relate to? Again, like I said a moment ago, when we hear a testimony, one of the first things we think of is, wow, that's relatable, right? There might be the exact same struggle that person went through, I went through, or other specifics of their story you connect with and relate to and all of this, right? So relatability is key. Again, solidarity. We don't want to feel like we're all alone with these thoughts that we think of that get stuck. The third kind of question to ask as you're looking at this first section is, what was my relationship with God like, if existent at all? So let me give you a little caveat for this one, right? So sometimes in our lives, right, we know God, but we haven't fully stepped into a relationship with God. And so if you knew God in the old me version, but you hadn't fully engaged with him and stepped into his story, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Where was your beginning, of dealing with God? Maybe you were angry at God, maybe because of a trauma or a tragedy in your past. You weren't stepping into a relationship with him because he represented, fair or unfair, right, all of that pain from your past, right? So what was your relationship like with God before you stepped into the new me? And then the fourth little question to ask yourself, what was my attitude to others like? How did 3 kind of influence 4, right? If you have a relationship with God that was very primitive or very touch and go for a while, how did that then relate to your relationships? How did that view the lens of how you saw people? And 5, what was the low point? CR, we call it rock bottom, right? But there might be a moment you remember where you're like, yeah, that was it. That was my low point. That was when I knew I needed help. That's when I knew I needed Jesus. That's when I knew I needed to make that phone call, whatever that is for you. So this is, I always caution people, we don't go back to the past to dig up the bones, the skeletons, and then be haunted by them. That's not why we do it. We go back to use it as something to propel us forward into the future and to see how the past informed where we are now and where we're going. So don't get stuck there. Don't get stuck there. All right, so our second section, first section, the old me. Second section, my experiences and changes that led to Jesus, right? So we have before Jesus is kind of section 1. Section 2 is kind of what led to Jesus. So this might be a little bit of a shorter part of the section as you're writing it out, but this is your pivot point. What was your pivot point when it came to the before and the after Jesus? So the first question is how. It's just kind of simply, when did it happen for you? How did you make a decision to follow Jesus? What were the different things that led up to that decision? Key people that led to you making that decision, key moments, things like that. And secondly, how did my relationship grow immediately after making that decision? So tell me about the infancy, so to speak, of your relationship with Jesus. What were those first days and weeks and months like? Were you just, on fire for the Lord? You're just leaving Jesus bumper stickers on people's cars in the Sprouts parking lot. Like, what was that like? Tell me about that. What was your first reaction when you kind of felt that newness in Jesus? And the third one, who did God use, in my story to help me find Jesus? I kind of mentioned that with the first part, but who were some key people along the way? And they could be people that are still very much so in your life. They could also be people that God used for a season, and that's okay too, right? So who were some of the key people that God used in our story? I think as you guys go through this series on Elijah being one of the prophets, the role of a prophet in the Old Testament was always so intriguing to me, because a lot of these guys it was kind of a rough job if you think about it. Trying to tell people what they needed to change, trying to tell people how to course correct, and they almost always got flack for it, right? People didn't like that. They didn't like to be told, hey, you're not doing it right. But the role of a prophet is the mouthpiece of God. That's how I've heard it defined early on in my studies of Scripture, right? These prophets were God's mouthpiece in a time where they weren't hearing directly from God, but God was using a prophet to translate what God was telling them to the people. Sometimes it was a message of, again, correction. Oftentimes it was a message of correction. Sometimes it was a message of keep going, you got this. So you actually are kind of like Elijah. You can be God's mouthpiece. Your story being told is God speaking through you. So I just want to kind of, encourage you with that, right? So you might have some people that played that role for you in your story that led you to Jesus. So make sure you kind of mention that. All right, so then the third section, we have the before Jesus. We have the pivot point moment that led to the decision to follow him, or the moment where things kind of got clearer for you as far as direction and who God is. Third section is now, how did you change from that point on? What does the new me look like? So some questions to go with the new me. What changes has God made in my relationship with others? Oftentimes with God in our life, at the center, it changes how we view other people and maybe even how we treat other people. So how has that happened in your life? I think God uses people, obviously, in multiple ways in our lives to pour into us, to help us grow, sometimes to challenge us, right? To work on our patience. So how have relationships in general looked like since you've made that decision? So the second one is, what areas of my old life are gone, and how have they changed? So what's new? What's different? What's changed in your life since Jesus entered it? Sorry, I feel like I'm throwing these at you. Feel free to take pictures of the screen. That works too. Number 3, what are some of the great benefits that I have received from walking with Jesus? Such a unique way to put that. And I don't think we often pause to think of it in those terms, right? We know that God is so important and that he changes us from the inside out. But there's benefits. It sounds like insurance or something, right? There's benefits that we receive from walking with Jesus. Again, that hope that's infused in you when you know Christ, that is the first benefit I think of. It doesn't mean your life is easy all of a sudden. It doesn't mean you don't go through hard times. It doesn't mean you don't have struggles. It doesn't mean you don't, question things again, right? But it gives you this thread of hope that stays strong, that holds you on the road and the place where you need to be. And so what are some other benefits you can think of that following Jesus? Maybe it's simply, it brought you to the church where you worship, and that brought you to relationships that are now your people that are going to be lifelong friends. Like, that could be kind of a benefit from following Jesus. So what are some of the things that have influenced you and caused you, benefited your life from following him? And then the fourth one under this section is just, how are you growing? What's your program? What's your program? And you might be, Matt, I don't have a program. I'm like, well, you're here, and this is part of your program, right? You wouldn't have come if you weren't invested in growing. And so, but think bigger than just this room. This is awesome. This ministry is a big piece of your program. What are other pieces of your program? And when I say program, I mean the way you are growing in your faith, the way you are iron sharpening iron, the way you are reading the word. Maybe you're a journaler. Maybe you like to go for drives and just talk to God in your car, like whatever. Whatever it is, what's part of your program? Is there other ministries you're involved in outside of Flourish that you would say that's part of part of my program too? Do you have a mentor? Do you have another lady that you're walking through life with that's challenging you, holding you accountable? And then I would say how you're serving is also part of your program. How are you serving? How are you serving in the church? We got lots of avenues to serve here at the Grove. There's other areas outside the church, of course. How are you serving? How are you pouring in to what God is doing in your life and then giving back and furthering that message? So that leads to the fourth section, which is the outreach, the what now. How do you take this life change that's happened in you and share it with others and encourage others? It's not just giving a testimony. That is definitely a way you can do that. But it's how is your life an encouragement to other people that you see along the way? Maybe people that are newer in their faith or not there yet. They don't have faith yet in God. So how do we share? And I challenge you, think about not just the overt ways you share your faith with God, but what are some of the covert ways, the little ways, right? The moms group at school or PTOs or these different things where you have relationships. And I realized as a dad, all of a sudden my friends are whoever or the parents of my kids' friends, right? Like that's how that works. And so we have these people or neighbors or whoever that kind of are there in our lives. How are we living out our faith? Maybe sometimes we're directly getting to say it, but you're always sharing your faith if you're living your faith. Does that make sense? So how are the little ways that you are showing them Jesus, maybe without even saying it? The famous quote, preach the gospel at all times, and as a last resort, use words, right? And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. Your life is a testimony. We're just today talking about how to write it and share it specifically, but I just want you to know you and how you live is a testimony in and of itself, by itself. So a couple guidelines just to throw in here if you ever get the opportunity, and I believe Crystal's going to give you guys the opportunity to share your story with other people in a formal setting, kind of like this, where you have a microphone or you're just talking to a table or whatever. A couple other thoughts just to kind of help you stay on the right path. Again, there are variations of your story. CR does a 5-minute version of people's stories. They call them mini-monies, mini testimonies. So you could do that. It's just such a weird phrase, mini-moni. It rolls off the tongue. That's good. So you could do that. It could just be a little mini-moni. It could be a little small thing. It could just be a moment to tell someone a story that happened this week that pointed you back to God. That is most definitely a testimony. Like I said, there's all kinds of versions of testimonies. It could just be in casual conversation. That's completely fine. So the written testimony, again, why we read it is to keep people concise and on kind of the point as they tell their story. They've taken the time to write it out. And when you write out, you think, I said I wrote my story in 9 minutes. That's actually about a 20-minute testimony when you read it. So it's really not as long as it sounds. But writing it out is a really good discipline and a good place to start gathering your thoughts and processing. So they kind of, the rule of thumb is 12 to 17 minutes for a testimony. And then one thing I would say is, as if you are going through the process of writing a testimony, pray. Right? Because one of the things I heard, the last lady that shared her testimony, she walked in kind of in a hurry into the room. I'm like, how you doing? You okay? She's like, I've had a day. I'm like, oh, really? She's like, yeah, I don't think Satan wants me to share this tonight. And I'm like, so you're in the right place? She's like, I'm in the right place. I'm like, okay. So there is going to be a little bit of resistance, especially if God is calling you to it. So just keep that in mind. Pray over it. Have your tables praying for you, your accountability partners, because there's power in your story. And so guess what? The enemy doesn't want it to get out because there is power in it. And so that should be encouraging that you have something to say and it's God speaking through you. And then another thing, always throw, I hate that I just said throw in the Bible. That's not what I meant. Let me back up. Use scripture. That was much better attempt, in your testimony. So this is, some of you, I know you've got your life verses. You could probably rattle them off to me right now. That's awesome. Use those in your testimony. Because when you're telling your story, but then you're telling the scripture that had influenced your story, right? It's just so much more powerful. So use scripture, use a couple of verses, 2-3 verses that mean a lot to you and why. And that's just a great way to kind of cement the story that God's writing in you. And then my final kind of reminders for you guys is that it's God's story that he's writing through you. So don't think that it's something that people don't want to hear. It's a story that people need to hear. Don't mute your own voice, because in doing so, you're actually muting the story that God is telling in you, and it's powerful. So I'm going to kick it to the tables here in a minute. But here's what I want to say to you at your tables. Challenge each other, right? Challenge each other to do this. This could be a cool way for you to bond as a table. Just to say, hey, are you writing your testimony? Are you thinking through it? Are you going to write some of this down? And hold each other accountability. Accountability goes a long way to help us take the action. I'm the kind of person, I feel that stirring in my heart, but if I don't have someone holding me accountable, it starts to fade away, and then I don't follow through, and I don't like that. And so challenge each other. And then once you've written your testimony, CR needs testimonies, so come talk to me. We'd love for you to share it. And also, I think Crystal will be given some opportunities too. But it's a little bit of a bold thing. So be bold. Step out. Step into it. Because you'll never know what even just writing your testimony will do for furthering your own faith and keeping you on the path that God is keeping you on as well. So I'm going to just kind of leave you with 2 questions here for the next 5 minutes to turn to the ladies at your table to kind of discuss as we come to a close here. The first question, it's really one question and then a statement. The question is, what does the concept of sharing your story make you feel? So be honest. What were some knee-jerk reactions emotionally for you? Was that something that scared you? Was that something that got you fired up? Was it something that you're like, I've done that a million times, no big deal? Just share your initial thoughts on that. And that being said, the second part is, if you have shared your testimony before, tell your table what that experience was like for you. How did you go about that? What was that like? What was some of those experiences? What did that bring to your life? So with that, I'll send you back to your table. So again, the first thing is, what does the concept of sharing your story, what did that make you feel? And then secondly, if you have shared your testimony, what was that experience like? All right, you can discuss at your table.